Hello, my name is Phil Easter, historian and writer from Baltimore, Maryland, also known as the Amazing Memory Man. We're recording tonight on Monday, October 14th, 2024. This is story number 64 on my YouTube channel, which is Phil Easter, the Amazing Memory Man. Tonight we look back to the year 1964, 6 decades ago. A very interesting year it was, 1964, for many events in the news, political news and sports events, music and movies. The year began in America. It was still really a very sad time because on November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and Lyndon Johnson became president, and so there was still a great sadness in the early months of 1964. But at that time, there was a very popular television show every Sunday night on the CBS TV network called The Ed Sullivan Show. Ed Sullivan was a gentleman who often showed new acts of people who were singers, musicians, or comedians, actors, different type of acts he had on, magicians, all sorts of people. And the common expression at the time was, if you can make it on Ed Sullivan, you made it into show business. Well, in January of '64, Ed Sullivan was on a trip to London, a brief trip to London, and in an airport there, it just so happened the same day when 4 young men from Liverpool, already gaining some recognition in their home country of England, as well as Germany. They were already known, the Beatles, and some people in America had heard of them, but Ed Sullivan had not heard of them until that point, and someone mentioned that they're a really up-and-coming rock band from England, and he said, well, we should get them on the show. So indeed, they were invited to the next month in February. On February 7th, 1964, the 4 young lads from Liverpool, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, arrived at JFK Airport in New York City. And 2 nights later, on the night of February 9th, 1964, the Beatles appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, and it was one of the highest rated shows of all time, TV shows of any show. The 4 young lads from Liverpool brought their music to America, and the rest of the decade wasn't quite the same. They became very popular, and they came back again in 1964 for a tour of a number of American cities, including my hometown here in Baltimore. They came to Baltimore on Sunday, September 13th, 1964, and my mom looked into trying to get tickets for us. We lived in the Mount Vernon area of Baltimore, less than 1 mile from the Baltimore Civic Center, as that arena was called at the time. Subsequently, it has many different names. You know how it is in many cities. They rename buildings and sports arenas, but at that time it was simply called the Baltimore Civic Center. And we were under the impression there was only 1 concert and it was sold out. That's what we heard. But years later, down at the Maryland Historical Society, they had some photographs of the Beatles that day, and I found out they actually had a second concert that day in the evening, and the evening concert was not quite sold out. There were at least a few seats left. If only we had known that, but social media did not exist at the time, and that would have been a help, or perhaps we would have found out. But anyhow, I never got to see the Beatles in person, but I certainly became a big fan and watched them on a number of TV shows and several of their movies. Their best movie was called A Hard Day's Night, and that came out in 1964 also. So the Beatles, the great musical force, becoming famous in America in 1964. Now later that year, President Lyndon Johnson, on July 2nd, 1964, signed the Civil Rights Bill into law, a very important piece of legislation. Before that, people who owned restaurants and certain businesses could refuse entry to people based on their race or some other things that they didn't like about them, ethnicity or heritage or whatever. But then it became the law of the land. If you own a public, place for a restaurant or a store, you have to admit everybody. You cannot discriminate based on race or other things. July 2nd, 1964, that was signed into law by President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Some of the popular movies that came out that year, 1964, two wonderful musicals, Mary Poppins and My Fair Lady. And Mary Poppins starred the British actress Julie Andrews, a wonderful singer and actress, and Dick Van Dyke, who was a popular American television show. He had the Dick Van Dyke Show about that time, and was known for comedy and a very good dancer. And that was a very popular movie, Mary Poppins. And Julie Andrews would win Best Actress of the Year. But the movie that won Best Picture was My Fair Lady, starring Audrey Hepburn and Rex Harrison. And so that was a very wonderful musical too. Both of those stories, by the way, are set in London, England, around the year 1910. They're supposed to be somewhere, at least the first decade of the 20th century. And here they both came out the same year in 1964. Another highly acclaimed movie was the historical drama Becket, the story of Archbishop Thomas Becket and his first friendship, and then they became enemies with King Henry II of England in the 12th century. And the actors were Richard Burton as Becket and Peter O'Toole as King Henry II. That also came out in 1964, and it's one of my favorite historical movies ever. The James Bond movies were underway. They started in 1962 with Dr. No. 1963, the second Bond movie was From Russia with Love. But in 1964, the third Bond movie is one of the most popular ever, Goldfinger. And the song from Goldfinger, sung by a British lady, Shirley Bassey, became one of the most famous songs from any movie ever, the song from Goldfinger. And that was the third James Bond movie ever made. In October, the Summer Olympics were held. Not July or August, as they usually are, but they were held in Tokyo in October 1964. And there was a touching moment at the opening ceremony. As you know, every opening ceremony, one of the most special moments is when a young runner, usually from the host nation, will run into the stadium and light the torch of the flame that will burn during the 2 weeks of the Olympics. Well, the young man chosen was 19 years old, named Yoshinori Sakai. He was not born on just any day, on just any city in Japan. He was born August 6, 1945, in a city called Hiroshima. On the day when the atomic bomb killed 80,000 people, what is the chance a newborn infant would even survive and someday light a very different fire, the Olympic flame, symbol of peace and friendship for people the world over? And the Tokyo Games were one of the best ever. Americans did very well in many events, but two events which Americans were not known for, the distance running events, the 5,000 and 10,000 meters, usually won by Europeans up until that point, and subsequently in more recent years, many runners from Africa do well in those events. But a surprise, and the only time Americans ever won the 5 and 10,000 meters in the Olympics, it was the very same year, 1964. Bob Schul won the 5,000 meters, and an American Indian, Billy Mills, was the real surprise winner in the 10,000 meter race. The favorite was Ron Clark from Australia, who set many world records, but he never won an Olympic gold medal, even though in many other track meets, less important than the Olympics, he would do well. But Billy Mills, who was also a Marine at the time, a United States Marine, pulled the great upset, winning the 10,000 meters. The joke was, before Tokyo, Americans were known to often win the 100 and 200 and the 400 meters, the shorter races. The joke went, when Americans want to go more than 800 meters, they drive cars, But the American distance runners came through in those Olympics. The marathon, however, was won by the great runner from Ethiopia, Abibi Bikili. He won in Rome 4 years earlier. That time he ran barefoot through the hard cobblestone streets of Rome. His feet were bleeding as he won his country's first gold medal, Ethiopia, and for the classic marathon race of 26.2 miles. Now, 4 years later in Tokyo, he wore shoes this time and improved by about 3 minutes. His time was 2 hours, 12 minutes and something. And in Rome, it was around 2 hours and 15 minutes and so many seconds. But he's the first of only 2 men to ever win the marathon twice. It's a very hard event to repeat. And with shoes or without, once again, Bikili was the champion marathon runner. But here's something interesting. 2 British athletes, the British are not known for long jumping at all. And usually Americans or sometimes Jamaicans win the long jump competition. But in both the men's and women's long jump, Mary Rand and Lynn Davies is the man, and Mary Rand, they won the respective long jumps for men and women from Great Britain. And never before in 1964 did a British man or woman win a long jump, and never since. And here they both did it the same year. Another odd fact about the Tokyo Games. America's Bobby Hayes won the 100 meters, one of the fastest runs at that point, and then he became a pro football player. He played wide receiver for the Dallas Cowboys for many years. One of the best wide receivers in NFL history, Bob Hayes. So the Tokyo Games were very successful, and the first of 2 times the Olympics were held in October. 4 years later in Mexico City, they were also held in October. The presidential election in November was between Lyndon Johnson, the incumbent, and Senator Barry Goldwater from the state of Arizona. And Johnson won in a landslide over Barry Goldwater, the Republican candidate for president. But I had a brief trip to Boston in September of that year. My mom and I went up to Boston for just a few days. We stayed at a very nice hotel called the Ritz-Carlton, and it just so happened Barry Goldwater was campaigning in Boston then, and I saw him just briefly in the hotel lobby. And I turned 12 years old in October of 1964. So Lyndon Johnson won the election in November and would serve 4 more years as president. 1964, 60 years ago, many interesting events, and also the Baseball World Series was between the New York Yankees and St. Louis Cardinals. And that's the first time I ever watched baseball World Series games on TV. And the Cardinals won in 7 games, a close series. They won 4 games to 3. But I'm happy to say that my favorite individual baseball player ever, Brooks Robinson of the Baltimore Orioles, nonetheless was voted most valuable player of the American League, even though the Yankees won the pennant. The Orioles finished in 3rd place out of, I think it was 10 teams at that point in the American League. But still, they considered Brooks Robinson the best individual player. He always played a very good 3rd base defensively, but that year he was a very good hitter too. He had 118 runs batted in, so they voted Brooks Robinson most valuable player of the American League. Well, those are a number of events I remember for the year 1964, 60 years ago this year. This is Phil Easter, the Amazing Memory Man. We'll see you next time for story number 65, another story on another subject. Thank you and good night.